everyone. Welcome to another week with the Word Made Digital podcast. I'm your host, Joanna, and today on the show, we have Sheila Walsh. I'm really excited about this conversation. I got to sit down with her when she was in Canada for a little while, just a few weeks ago, and she's in Canada talking about a new book that she's published called It's Okay Not to Be Okay. And if you don't know Sheila is really a prolific person in Christian media, particularly in the U.S. She was a signed songwriter through the 80s and 90s. Maybe you knew her then. She was one of the hosts of the 700 Club, doing all kinds of stuff with hosting TV, and she still continues to do that. She's also been on Women of Faith tours, and she's a Bible teacher, and she writes books, all these kinds of things. And so we sat down to talk about what does it look like to be a person who is in the public eye, particularly when things are not okay. So her book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, is telling the story of when things began to kind of fall apart for her in a really public way, particularly to do with her mental health. So we're going to have a really honest conversation. I think she comes with decades and decades of experience and in this topic. And so anytime I have an opportunity to listen to someone who is just that much further along than me, I want to lean in and try and glean whatever I can from their experience. She's authentic, she's real, and she's lived through a lot. And so she has a lot to say to us about what it looks like to have both a personal, private life, but then also a public life that you have to balance while being authentic, but also dealing with a lot of things going on in your personal life and your mental health and in your family and things like that. So I think you're going to love this conversation with Sheila. It's a ton of fun, and you're going to notice this great Scottish accent that she has, which just sort of adds to it. So here's the conversation between me and Sheila Walsh.
You're listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur, where we discuss all things creative and communications for the church. The church carries the best news in the world, so we want to help you be the best creatives and communicators in the world. Let's go.
Well, hi, Sheila. Welcome to Word Made Digital. I'm so glad to have you.
I love the title of your podcast. That's intriguing.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, of course, it's out of John chapter 1, where I love in the message where it says the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. And so what does that look like in the digital world? Well, the Word becomes digital, and it moves onto our phones and onto this podcast and, onto the work that you do and all that kind of stuff. So I'd love, well, right off the bat, can you tell us just who are you? Give us a little synopsis of who is Sheila?
Well, I was born in the west coast of Scotland. I was one of 3 children, born into a Christian family, which wouldn't be unusual in certain parts of Canada, or certainly not in America, but in Scotland was very rare, where less than 7% of our population even attend church. So to have a mom and dad who loved Jesus was quite a gift, but my father had a major brain injury when I was 5 and attempted to kill me before he committed suicide and took his own life. So I went from being a very kind of, tomboy kid to being a very scared kid, a very quiet child. And I went to seminary when I was 19 because I couldn't think of anything I would hate more. I thought, if I'd go and be a missionary in India, then God will think, well done you. Because I thought if your own father could turn on you, then maybe God could too. So I thought, I'm going to try and get this all right.
Wow.
And eventually God redirected my steps. I worked with Youth for Christ in Europe and then came to America, where as far as I could see, they didn't really need one more voice.
Well, they maybe needed a new accent, though.
maybe that.
And so that's interesting. I mean, we'll go back into more the depths of your own story and where it led you to this book that we're going to talk about. It's Okay Not to Be Okay is your latest book. But I'd love to know, like, media and television, the audience of this podcast, a lot of people are involved in that world themselves. Was that a dream for you? Did you fall into it? How did you be in there?
Well, I just graduated from seminary, and I was doing my very first record. And a guy who might be familiar to some of your older members of the audience, but a guy called Cliff Richard, who was, a pop star, but also very committed Christian. And he was producing my album just because he was a friend. And he got a call from the BBC in London saying, we want to do one show on contemporary Christian music. Will you host it? And Cliff said, well, I'm busy, but I have a friend who could host it. So I ended up hosting this show on the BBC. And it went so, I mean, I think they thought we're just going to do this to kind of appease, you know, all those churchgoers who live out in the boonies and are 85 years old. But they got so much positive feedback that we actually ended up, for 2 years, I hosted this show on BBC in London. And it was my first experience of television, and it became a medium that I love television.
Okay, that's amazing. And obviously then you've been doing it, the rest is history, quote unquote. At this point, millions and millions of people are watching the content that you're producing all over the world. Which probably isn't what you thought in those humble beginnings.
No, and it's interesting though, because I think even though I love television, I also think that there are major problems with television communicating spiritual truth, because there's something about the nature, like, for example, when I worked at the 700 Club, you had 7-minute segments to tell a story, you know, of a marriage that was devastated and broken, but within 7 minutes, it's all better.
Wow.
And I think that was one of the things that caused me a lot of problems. In fact, I actually went to Pat Robertson and said, I'm not sure I can do this anymore, because I think we're not representing the vast majority of people who are out there who don't get the miracle they'd like, but who still love God. So the 700 Club used to be 90 minutes in the States, and he cut it to 60, and he gave me the last 30. And he said, then you do with it what you want. And so I began to tell the stories of those who didn't have spectacular miracle stories, but who were struggling with things and loving God in the process, not getting the answers they pray for, and still not losing faith.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's true. The Christian media, I think the reputation, certainly in my generation, it can be viewed as cheesy. It can be viewed as too simplified. You know, people with perfect teeth and greasy hair who are promising things that just isn't necessarily reality for a lot of the people who are watching. And so
when we think we have to have certain accents or, you know, speak a certain way, you know, when you're on television, like you can have a normal conversation with somebody, but the minute the camera goes red, it's like, hello, in the name of the Lord. That's like, whoa, dude, what happened?
Your TV voice turns on.
Yes.
You sounds like a used car salesman or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, yes. I know exactly what you mean. And so your heart for maybe the more authentic story, or the story that doesn't wrap up as nicely in a bow, was that I'm not sure where in the timeline that was, because I'd like to go more into your own story. Were you doing this all throughout, or you had mental health things that we'd love to talk to you about today, but where in the timeline did you begin trying to tell less perfect stories?
I was at the Christian Broadcasting Network for 5 years, and this came in the last 2 years, because I got a letter from a girl who said, I watch your program twice a day, and sometimes it helps me, and sometimes I want to take my shoe off and throw it through the screen. Wow. And she included a phone number. So I called her and I said, I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. Number one, why do you watch it twice a day? And she said, because I'm terminally ill. And so I look for anything that could be encouraging. And I said, okay, here's my real question. Why do you sometimes want to take off your shoe and throw it through the screen? And she said, because you never tell stories of people like me. So she was my very first guest. I got to fly her in with a nurse because her health was very diminished. And it was one of the I felt like I was on holy ground, listening to this person who physically was disintegrating, and yet her faith was strong and vibrant. So that was for the last 2 years of my time. I would do the 700 Club in the morning and then go straight in to do that show. But the way I think about it now, there was just this distant rumble going on in my own soul. I felt like I was like standing on the edge of a volcano, and there was something underneath me that was just getting louder and louder every day.
Wow. I think of, it's a story that's close to my heart. It's a famous, the Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego are being thrown in the fiery furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar because they refused to bow down to an idol. And they say, our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, we won't back down. And it's that kind of faith that you're describing in this woman who was dying, and I'm not sure what she was exactly sick with, but the power of the testimony of her faith in the midst of the pain, the sorrow, the grief, not those, when those young men declared that to the king, they didn't know if they would come out the other side. Yeah, so that's powerful. And so let's dive further into then this in your own story. So there was, for our audience, there was a time where all these pieces, maybe you want to start a little more into sort of what you were holding together over your whole life, you felt, from your childhood until your adulthood. And then it all kind of came to a head really like on air, or my understanding is that it was within the television studio that things began to break for you. Can you tell us about that?
In Scotland, back when I was a child, and it's not terribly different now, we don't talk a lot about what we feel. And so after my father's funeral, which, we were not allowed to attend, my mom came home.
Wow.
No, my mom came home in a black dress and a black hat, and she did something that I didn't quite understand, but she took every photograph of my father off the walls and off the tables, and she put them in a little suitcase, which she locked and pushed under the bed, and we never mentioned his name again. And knowing my mom, I know now that I think she thought if Sheila wants to talk, then I'm going to let her initiate the conversation. She had no way of knowing just this huge question inside of me that no one could answer. What did my dad see in me that made him hate me so much?
Right.
And so I grew up with this profound sense of shame. So when I gave my life to Christ when I was 11, I remember my mom saying, not only is Jesus your Savior and your Lord, but you have a Heavenly Father watching over you. And I remember 11 thinking, oh, wow, I've got one more chance to get it right. Whatever my earthly dad saw in me, my Heavenly Father's never, I'm going to be the perfect Christian if it kills me. And it almost did.
It almost did. Yeah. And so there was a day, or maybe it wasn't, again, maybe in the Hollywood version of the story, it was a day, but perhaps in real life it was a series of moments, but it began to kind of crack in your adult life. Tell us what happened there.
Yeah. Well, I went to seminary to train to be a missionary in India, but God redirected my steps, and I ended up eventually in the States, and I was co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. And I had never heard of clinical depression, and certainly not for somebody in leadership or Christian leadership. But little signs, like I would go to the ATM machine and couldn't remember my PIN number. I couldn't sleep. I just felt this overwhelming sadness, not like the kind you have in a bad day, but just this winter in your soul.
Wow.
But then one day on a live show, a guest turned the tables on me, and instead of answering my question, she asked me, hey, you sit here every day asking us questions, how are you doing? And I didn't anticipate it, and I didn't have time to pull up that wall, and I started to cry. I hadn't cried in years, and I couldn't pull myself together. So eventually they threw to a commercial break, and I took off my mic, and I walked out the studio and locked myself in my dressing room. And as far as I was concerned, my life was over.
Because, you just sort of, you feel like your life's over, you embarrassed yourself publicly, or you mean you didn't know how to get out of this, as you described, like the winter of the soul?
No, because I felt like I had failed in what I'd promised God.
Right.
I promised God I'd never let him down. I promised God that I would get it right. No matter what anybody else did, I promised God that I would behave perfectly.
Wow.
And so I called a friend of mine, and a guy called Dr. Henry Cloud, and I said to him, Henry, I think I'm losing my mind. And he said, no, you're not, but you need some help, and you need it quickly. So that morning, I co-hosted the 700 Club, and by that evening, I was in the locked ward of a psychiatric hospital.
Wow. And so there's reality. There's real mental health. There's a conversation, obviously, culturally today. It's become a la mode to talk more about mental health. And I think some people maybe are misdiagnosing themselves about mild depression, but what you're talking about is really more of a genuine mental breakdown, a true clinical depression.
Yeah, and the inability to function. I remember the first day when the psychiatrist talked to me about medication, and I, out of my ignorance, said, I don't want any of your happy pills. And he said, no, those are street drugs. We don't have those. I said, what we have is medication to restore the chemical imbalance in your brain so that you can then begin to deal with the issues you have to deal with.
Right. If you can't get out of the cloud, how can you begin to unpack what's really sort of going on in your life. Yeah. So what do you think about the mental health climate we're in right now? How do you, as someone who, this is obviously close to your own heart, it's the context of the book in many ways. What do you think about how people are talking more publicly about mental health now?
I'm really encouraged by that, honestly, because I think, like, when I was released from the hospital in 1992 and went to the drugstore to fill my prescription for antidepressant medication, I was dreading that I'd bump into somebody who knew me, and what would I tell them I was getting? Because nobody talked. There was such a stigma, particularly in the church at that point. I mean, it was looked on as weakness. You know, if you had a brain tumor and you could show that on a scan, people are all over that. They'll pray for you from, here to Timbuktu. But you have clinical depression. It's like, well, surely as a believer, you can do all things through Christ who gives you strength. So I remember the first time that I stood up on a public platform, and I determined tonight I'm just going to tell my story. And I had no idea what would happen. But afterwards, I probably spent a couple of hours just standing, listening to other women's stories, saying, I've never heard anybody tell my story on a platform and not self-combust. And I began to realize, because I kind of thought I was the only one, and I began to realize how many people struggled and felt there was no safe place to tell the truth.
Yeah, and would you say that was true in the 90s and isn't, I mean, I think you said 1992-ish.
Yeah.
And isn't true today, or you actually think, as you travel and work and have this conversation, it's still taboo, or what do you think about that in the church?
I think I see three different scenarios. I see some places where it's definitely still taboo. In fact, I met a woman not long ago who showed me a photograph of her daughter, beautiful girl in her early 20s, who was on staff at a big church and had asked for a short leave of absence to deal with some depression. And she was told, we don't believe in that. We will pray for you. And that young woman took her life. And that kind of ignorance, I mean, in the genuine sense of ignorance, of not understanding, is heartbreaking. But I think there is definitely, the second scenario is definitely a place where the dialogue is becoming, it's okay to talk about it. Like I go to a large church in Dallas. It's a Baptist church. Technically, I mean, we're conservative, but my pastor allowed me to talk about my struggle with suicidal thoughts, my hospitalization. And when he began to see the need in our own church, we've now taken on a pastor who is just there to deal with these issues.
Wow.
But the third scenario is a slightly more troubling to me, where it becomes such a buzzword that it's like, it's the thing now. It's like, we're all depressed, or we're all anxious, or we're all this. And I think,
self-diagnosed.
Yeah.
I had a bad couple days, and I'm using medical terms to describe it. Yeah.
I went back to buy that dress, and it's no longer available in my size, so I need medication. It's just, that's slightly troubling to me. But I would say that's the smallest of all of it. But the fact that I was asked, my friends, Kay and Rick Warren, who had a son who committed suicide.
Yeah.
And Matthew was just an adorable person. But he'd struggled since he was a child. In fact, when he was 10 years old, on Mother's Day, he asked his mom, Kay, is there any way that you could help me in my life? So he struggled and they tried everything. But after Matthew took his own life, they have really invested they've planted their grief into the soil of being able to say to other people, listen, we want to be there to help. And so I see all sorts of things springing up in different places, and just opening the conversation and letting people know this is safe space. Because my own personal belief is we should shine the brightest light into the darkest corners of the church, whether it's online pornography or depression or anything. If somebody is struggling with it, we should have a safe place to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I always hope that the church would be a leader of these kinds of conversations. And often we're a bit in response to, culture is talking about sexual assault. So now the church is doing, the hashtag church too. And people are talking about, or people are beginning to feel the courage to come forward about abuse in the church, or whether it's mental health, or whatever the thing is of the day. But that, I think we're so well equipped compared to a lot of other movements or groups to have honest conversation about not being okay. in whatever
In fact,
that looks like.
When Rick and Kay had their first, they called it a symposium on the church and mental health, and they asked me to speak on the first night, which I was really grateful for, because after that they had like the Surgeon General of America, the head of the American Psychiatric Association. I was like, please let me go before the people who know all the big words. But my opening line was something I could never have said before. I said, I am profoundly grateful for the gift of mental illness, because I can look into the eyes of someone else who's struggling and saying, me too, I understand, I get it.
Wow.
Because it's such, when you think you're the only one, you feel as if you've failed God, you feel as heaven is silent, and you feel alone, desperate. And to be able just to say to other people, you know what, you're not alone. Mental illness is not curable, but it's treatable. And there is a path, and we can walk through this path together.
Wow. And so, I mean, I'm hearing you talk at this point in your life very openly about mental health. How do you balance the personal, private life that you lead with your family and with your loved ones, with your trusted friends, with your doctors, and then this public life that you also lead? Because a lot of people who are listening to this podcast will feel that tension in themselves, the personal life and the public life. How did you begin to even start talking about this? I mean, obviously there's parts of it you are more free to share at different times.
Yeah. I check my wounds. If they're fresh wounds and they still bleed, then I don't talk about them. You know, I've seen situations where people on a platform have addressed something and they're clearly in the beginning stages of the process, and you almost then end up bleeding all over your audience. But I've found that, you know, when it's, that's why one of the chapters in the book is called Celebrate Your Scars as Tattoos of Triumph, because a scar, it's a mark, but it's not an open wound. It's a place, to me, scars are proof that God heals. Wow. And I have drawn boundaries between, you know, I'm very careful to only share my own story. I don't share what happened to my sister or my brother or my mother. You know, I don't, if anything in that arena affects my husband or my son, that is off limits. And one of the most important things for me was learning that no is an entire sentence. You know, you don't have to expand on it. Sometimes people want you to just tell me everything about this. And it's like, you know what? I mean, it was a simple lesson I learned when my son was little. When he was, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, I would say on every birthday, okay, choose one thing this year that you want you and I to do together. It's just our thing. So he chose that on Tuesday nights we would play basketball. So I had the woman in my neighborhood came around the doorbell one day and said, you know, we would love to start a Bible study in the neighborhood. Would you be willing to host it? And I'm like, yeah, sure, I'd love that. And they said, well, we chose Tuesday night because we know you go to something at the church on Wednesday. And I said, actually, I can't do Tuesday night. And they said, well, why not? And I said, I shoot hoops with my son on Tuesday night. And this woman looked at me and said, are you telling me that shooting hoops with your son is more important than leading a Bible study? And I said, that is exactly what I'm telling you. Because if you try to be responsible for everybody else's expectations of you, but your own family feel as if you don't keep your word, then who have we become?
Right. And very easy in public ministry and the pressures of, and I would imagine for a lot of people, I know a lot of men talk about that at work, they're getting praised and awarded for their successes, and at home the relationships can be harder. You don't get as much praise when you bring the garbage to the road, or you know, I don't know, you take the dog for a walk or whatever. The things we do around our family life we don't often get as much praise for, but then in the office or the public life, a media driven life, you get more likes, you get more pats on the back, more public praise, and so it's easy to let that be the thing that really sways what your values are, or what kind of what part of you want to present, because you know the thing that's going to make you feel better when people like it.
I think that's such a good point. But I think that family and community is where we learn who we really are and what really matters. I mean, I remember at one point I released a children's CD of Celtic lullabies, and I got all sorts of great feedback and people saying, this is amazing, my children couldn't sleep and now they sleep. And so one night I'm sitting at the edge of my son's bed and I decided I'm going to sing him one of these lullabies, and halfway through he said, Mom, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm trying to sleep here. That there's something about about who we really are when nobody else is watching, who we're with just that small group of people that just, reminds us that all the stuff that other people pat us on the back for, that's lovely, but it's not our real lives. It's not to me, everything that happens on a platform should come out of the reality of what happens in my home, as opposed to dragging everything that happens on a platform into my home and thinking this is how we should all be living.
Right. And so, people are listening to this, and there's some people who are thinking, I know that that's me. I know that there's an incongruency with what I'm presenting to the world and sort of what's going on in my internal life or my personal life. What would you say to people who feel like they're in a public position, and so they aren't sure that it's okay to not be okay? What would you say to people who they kind of know they're not okay, but how do they go about dealing with that?
Yeah, that's a hard one to navigate, because even when I was in seminary, we were taught, if you're a pastor, don't get too close to anybody in the church. You need to just, keep yourself private and not open up. And yet we know that that's not what God intended. Even in Eden, when everything is perfect, God looked at Adam and said, this is not good. It's not good that he's alone. So even in perfection, it wasn't good to be alone. We are built for community, but it's finding safe places and safe people to be able to be honest with. But I don't think we can do that unless you've done that huge step of daring to have a gut level, unedited conversation with God, where you actually tell God everything. I remember in that hospital when I was at the end of myself, beating my fists on the carpet and saying, I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of trying to be perfect. I can't do that. And all I felt at the end of this was just this simple, I know, and I'm here.
Wow.
That for me, it begins, that authenticity has to begin with Christ first. And from there, then I think we learn to navigate places where we can share what's appropriate of our story, but always know that our true north is at his feet.
And so with this book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay, you've written other books before, but why this book at this time? Why was this the moment to tell this part of the story?
Because I noticed over the last 2 or 3 years, I've written, as you say, different books, talked about different stages and parts of my life, and I've talked about being hospitalized, I've talked about dealing with suicidal thoughts, I talked about all of that. And I began to notice this common thread of people writing and saying, thank you for letting me know I'm not alone.
Wow.
But now what? Now I feel like I'm stuck and struggling. So basically what I did was I kind of did a whole mental shift and thought, I'm just going to write down the 8 things that God used in my own life to move me forward. So I just wanted it to be very practical and very doable. But they were all things that were hugely significant for me. Yeah.
And as you say, it's not self-help.
No, it's not self-help. In fact, let me just grab my Bible really quickly. You can just whistle while I'm doing this.
Oh, we can. I think we can still hear you while you're.
Oh, you can? Okay.
While you're stepped away for a moment.
In Matthew, there's a passage that we all know really, really well. But I looked up in Matthew's Gospel in the Message. Matthew 16:24 says, where do we go? Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Yeah. If anyone wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross and follow me. If you hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you'll save it. But in the Message, it says, then Jesus went to work on his disciples. Anyone who intends to come with me has to let me lead. You're not in the driver's seat. I am. Don't run from suffering. Embrace it. Follow me, and I'll show you how. Self-help is no help at all. Self-sacrifice is the way, my way, to finding yourself, your true self. So to me, it's not self-help, it's God help. I've tried self-help before and it didn't help at all.
Yeah, well, and people do. The bookshelves in every store are full of self-help, and people are using meditation apps and all these things. And there's some amount of help in a short period in a superficial way that does help people. But it leaves us wanting more. There is a meaning that is lacking in that kind of self-help without the depth of the eternal God. And so maybe as sort of one of my last questions for you in relation to this, I think I look to you as someone, I'm a little bit younger than you.
You're a lot younger than me.
And so I am someone who's earlier in my career, and I know other people listening, some of us are in that same place, especially people who love podcasts. A lot of millennials, we love podcasts. And so older people do too, but millennials, we've really embraced them. So I know a lot of my audience is younger. And we're looking to people like you and of your generation, and we see on one hand, there's this desire to be, we don't maybe say it this way, but there's this Christian celebrity that is worshipped. The people we follow on social media and we feel like we know them, but we don't know them. Just because they posted a picture of their kids at Halloween doesn't mean we actually know anything about these people and what's really going on with them. But these people we admire. And then also we've seen a lot of crash and burn lately of a lot of people we love and people we admire. And we're thinking, how are we going to do this in the long haul? There's this quote here. I'd love you to sort of speak around this topic, just this understanding. It says in your book, understanding that Christ is the hero of our stories allows us to be human. That Christ is the hero versus the Christian celebrity. And I'm sure that's a wrestle for anyone who has a public life where people follow them and listen to what they say. But how do you do that in the long term without it being about you? How do you genuinely make Jesus the hero when we're all sort of selfish?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that is a very important question. And one of my passionate commitments over the last 20 years is to try and demythicize the platform. Because somehow we assume that if somebody is up there, it's because they've achieved some level of whatever we think would be achievable, and that therefore we should look up to them. And there's a certain, Scripture talks about honoring, and I think, we do honor those. I honor those in my life who've really mentored and helped me. But it crosses a line when we start to confuse who they really are. So every time I speak, I talk about the fact that the fact that this feeding of the 5,000 is in all four Gospels is interesting to me. It's obviously significant. But Mark gives a little detail that the others just don't include. They're looking at it, this, 5,000 men, so probably 10,000 people. And if you've got that many people on a hillside, there's a lot of food. I mean, if you've got mothers, you've got snacks. But nobody thinks it's enough. And the only one who offers up is this little boy. And my understanding of ministry is we take our not enough, clearly not enough, and we give it to Jesus, and he blesses it and breaks it and feeds his people. I mean, I do that as a discipline every single day, whether I'm speaking to 10 people or 10,000 people. Lord, this is not enough. And I communicate that as well as I can to the audience. I'm not the good news. Jesus is.
Right.
But I think we can almost try and shellac our lives to make them look more glittery than they really are. And I think it's a disservice to those who are, particularly if younger people are watching us. There's a beauty in being transparent, not inappropriately so, but just in telling the truth, sharing the things that worked and the things that didn't work, the struggles. I mean, I've seen it in my own life with my son. I've learned the importance of saying, I was wrong there. I'm really sorry. I thought that was the right thing to do, but I really don't think it was the right thing to do. And yeah, I think our culture, when Paul, if you think about this, which is mind-blowing to me, when he wrote to the church in Rome, back in those days with no Instagram, no Twitter, no whatever, everybody else, nothing. When Paul said, don't be conformed to this world, it's obviously been a problem for a long, long time if Paul needed to say that.
Yeah.
So I think that's just one of the things we have to constantly wrestle with. Don't be conformed, but be transformed.
Wow. So people are going to want more of you. They're going to want... Not
necessarily.
No, I mean, people are going to... obviously, people can find your book. It's on Amazon. It's in bookstores in Canada. We have a store called Chapters Indigo. It's in U.S. bookstores as well. And but you, your stories, your messages, where can people find you online?
Instagram, I'm Sheila Walsh 1. And on Facebook, I'm Sheila Walsh Connects, but I have a website, just sheilawalsh.com,
Okay.
and I try and post things there as often as I can.
Awesome. Well, we'll link all that in the show notes so that people can find you. I've given away a few copies of your book, and it's been amazing already to see that people are reading the story and just being impacted by it. Wherever they may find themselves. And so I'm just grateful for your ministry, grateful for a long history of faithfulness to God by being honest before Him. It's just a testimony to me and to all of us who are listening about what God can do with us when He is taking the wheel. As it says, Jesus take the wheel. It's literally what you read out of the scripture today.
No, I love that. And thanks so much for letting me be on your podcast. I just hear great things from everybody who listens to it. They love it.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Sheila Walsh as much as I did. If you're like me, you maybe want to go now deep dive and learn a little bit more about her story, and where she's come from. So you can check a bunch of that stuff out on her website and social media. There's some videos on there even that share more of her story, and maybe you want to pick up a copy of her book, It's Okay Not to Be Okay. Now, I've given away a couple copies already, so I don't have any more to give you, but you can find it on Amazon. You can go to the local bookstore and you can grab a copy. A bunch of links for her stuff is going to be in the show notes as well down below. Okay, so next week's episode, we're going to be talking to my friend Tim Schrader. If you don't know Tim, Tim is the guy behind a lot of major brands and releases and projects that you've probably heard of. He works with books, and he works with music, and he works with churches on major launches of creative projects. And some of them he's able to talk about, some of them maybe he can't mention by name, but he has a lot of wisdom and experience over lots of years of learning how to do great social media for church. And we're going to talk about sort of where it has come from and where he thinks it's going into the future for church. But also we're going to talk about a particular project that he's involved in to do with LGBTQ and the church. It's called Church Clarity. Maybe you've already heard of it, but what that is an organization that's trying to encourage churches to be more clear about their position theologically about LGBTQ, because a lot of people are coming into churches and have questions about the position on that, but they're not sure which way the church may fall on the spectrum of theology and that issue, and so that can in the end up actually hurting people. So we're going to obviously get into some of the nitty-gritty of that with him. It's going to be a bit of a hot button issue, a culturally relevant conversation. I think you're going to love hearing his heart and his passion for using social media for the growth of the church, for the love of the church, and to reach lots of people for Jesus. So see you next week on Word Made Digital.
Thanks for listening to the Word Made Digital podcast with Joanna LaFleur. Head over to joannalafleur.com for more practical tools, interviews, and videos for creatives and communicators. We'd love to help you be the best you can be at communicating the best news in the world. Tap that subscribe button.